this actually a text of a myth where the snake bites and causes mortality for humanity in a garden, and the gods make a pact with the underworld deity Haranu and end up having him get rid of the snake.
Dr. Joshua Bowen, quick question. Is Genesis,
let's just say Genesis period, but specifically, just to be more precise, Genesis 1 through 11 mythology?
Yeah, no question.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have a wonderful day. So we need to get into this, right? I saw a recent, well, I didn't watch the whole thing, started to watch it. I saw that the Pete Enns was talking with William Lane Craig about Adam existing and theologically. And I'm like, now I'm not saying Pete was saying that. I think Pete thinks he's myth, but he's dealing with William Lane Craig, who's trying to negotiate and do all this crap. Let's talk about the myth of Genesis. Genesis, let's start at the very beginning and work our way to 11 and just have fun. This is, you may not be 100% precise about everything because we're just hip firing here. The very opening, when in the beginnings, Enuma Elish.
Yeah, I mean, this is the way that ancient Mesopotamian in particular writers constructed cosmogonies. They would start with these temporal clauses like when on high, and then the Enuma Elish. I mean, you see this in a wide variety of sources that talk about the creation of the world or the creation of people, and I go through several of them in the chapter in the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, where I just sort of lay out several of them. But it's setting up this time where before things had been created, before things had been placed in order, before the gods had set all of these things together, created humanity, whatever. It's this when clause,
right?
And so both Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 2:4 show this type of temporal clause. So Genesis 1:1, when God began to create the heavens and the earth, this temporal construction. Same is true in 2:4, right? And so it doesn't. It fits very well in that same category.
The genre of myth, of creation myth. This is a question that's silly for academics such as yourself, or not. You understand it, but like people in your ivory tower. Is Genesis older than Enuma Elish, Atrahasis epic, the Sumerian creation stories, or even Akkadian stories we're finding in these tablets and stuff? Is it older than that?
No.
And we know this.
Yes, no question.
Why aren't those gods the true ones and that creation story the accurate ones instead of the Genesis then?
Yes, yeah. The question itself, like I understand why you're asking it, but even just hearing it now, knowing that you're going to ask it, sounds like such a weird question.
I know.
Why isn't one true? And I think, the idea here is that in the same way that the Anzu myth isn't more true than the Enuma Elish, because it's a story that's a narrative that's older, a mythological text that's older. The Enuma Elish is utilizing at a later time. Like earlier doesn't mean better. Earlier doesn't mean true.
Right.
Whatever that might mean. It just means that an earlier text is being utilized by a later text, which is what they all did.
Yeah, I guess, and you're right. Older doesn't mean, but what do you do when you know the newer is using the older, but spinning it?
Sure. I mean,
like, how do you, I guess what I'm getting at is like, it's a weird thing that I know that the scholars in your field, that's not their goal, to sift through this philosophy kind of conclusion of like the truth claims of it. But I sit there and I see to myself, I think you and I would both agree, looking at this text going, yeah, it's utilizing it, and it also walks, talks, and acts like it in many ways, while it does different things. Like, this is a stumbling block for Christians, and I imagine even Orthodox Jews or others who they're on the conservative spectrum there, that are looking at it going, no, the creation story was actually told by Abraham. He was way back here and he got the insights. Or Moses was being told by God on the mountain the true story. Like all of these myths that are before that it's working in the same vein with, and we're supposed to segue this in a special pleading category as this one's true, and those are red flags to me, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, certainly. And, I think that Christianity, depending on, again, what kind of Christianity we're talking about, and the more conservative type of Christianity is going to be looking at these texts and they fight tooth and nail to keep that categorization of myth away from the primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11. And again, we've talked about it a number of times. Like, I think that's it's a silly thing to do. Let it be what it is.
Yeah.
And just create an interpretive framework that better accounts for the data points, period. And so when I think about the Genesis story in that context, the primeval history, we need to be looking at the newer story, the younger story, and asking the question, okay, where is it the same? And now where is it different? And what are the theological points that the later writer is trying to make? And that's what's really interesting. Instead, what I see happening is, let's go find Noah's Ark. Yeah, there is a mountains. Let's see if we can figure out, would that vessel be able to float? And how can we see, if Genesis 7 here, when it talks about the waters went up 15 meters, does it mean that it went up 15 cubits over the tops of the mountains, or just does it mean up the mountains 15 cubits? And so it doesn't have to mean that it covers the whole. I mean,
anything to get out of this historical conundrum they put on the texts. Should we be thinking of Eretz, this word that's translated earth? Maybe it just means like land and like the local land. So it's just like a local flood. Like, yeah, and it's a waste. We know why they're doing it.
Yes.
Going back to Genesis 1-2, because we haven't even past that yet, but I want we'll get through it quick, is the Tehom, the word Tehom. And even contextually, you have chaos, there's no order, darkness upon the face of the deep, the Spirit of God hovers over the face of the waters, this Tehom. It seems like a demythologized, as many people think, a demythologized version of what happens with Marduk defeating Tiamat, the chaotic waters. And in this case, it isn't describing a sea beast or a dragon or anything like that. It's just waters being described here, right?
See, that's what makes the term interesting. So I cite the examples in that chapter. But if you look at the use of Tehom in other contexts, or the Tehomot, the plural form of it, you can see in the various contexts that it often does take on, like, it's personified.
Okay.
And so that's what I think that's what makes it such a useful term to use in that context to the writer, because I think the people that are looking at the text in this period, and this priestly writers, what he's putting down, understand this nuanced meaning that Tehom can have. So in other passages, you can see how, yes, God is, Yahweh is doing something that makes the waters flee, or frightens the Tehom. Like, these are, you're right to point this out, that the Enuma Elish has this sea goddess, Tiamat, and of course Tiamat and Tehom are both cognates with this Akkadian word tamtu, which means sea, right? Or that's the cognate. And so is one borrowing from the other? Not necessarily. One, they could just be both in, going back to tamtu, but nonetheless, the fact that the term is used in a personified way elsewhere, and given the other connections that you see in Genesis 1 to the Enuma Elish, or more broadly in the primeval history, I think it's very reasonable to think that term is being selected because of its connections in one way or another to the sea.
Then you get days, time, but also waters, separated from waters. This is unique to or is this a common thing, or is it really, is it fair for me to go, oh, it's just common that waters are separated from waters?
So there certainly is a theme of cosmogony in ancient Near Eastern, a theme of like watery, you know, mass, whatever, in the ancient Near East. But here it's much more precise than that, I think. So if you read through the Enuma Elish, you'll see that one of the things that Marduk does when he destroys Tiamat is he cuts her in half, uses half of her, stretches out her skin in order to make the heaven above, like the dome, and assigns guards to keep the waters back, to keep the waters above it. And this is precisely what we see in Genesis 1. So the rakia, the firmament, is created by Elohim and placed up there with the waters behind it or above it. And of course, then dry land appears, and now the other waters are down below. So this separation of water from water is clearly there. And of course, when we get to the flood tradition, certainly you have this rakia and the great depths being brought back into the conversation, where the sluice gates that are in the big firmament, the big dome that's overhead, are opened up, letting all the water back down.
Right.
And the great, wells of the deep or whatever are springs of the deep are allowed to burst forth, letting all that water back up.
Right.
And it does a recreation. I mean, Re-chaos, that's right.
So it's like a decreation and then back into
And in fact, Joseph Blankenship has a book with the title Creation, Uncreation, Recreation.
Oh, okay. Uncreation, I was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, you also see that kind of motif with Sodom and Gomorrah Lot kind of thing, where it rains, and the language is unique here, which is odd. Some of the commentators I've read, where they're like, it's using watery language for fire. It's like it rained fire. Like it's using, and then talks about I can't remember exact details here, but it has like this idea of water, which is like what we see earlier in the flood myths, except they're incorporating a fiery apocalypse instead of a watery apocalypse. That's neither here nor there. That is in Genesis, but it's later. It's beyond what we're trying to touch today. To just go back to now the waters are separated. You got creation, and it is good, and these kinds of things. And then we get into chapter 2. Is there anything in this area that you're wanting to touch on that you find in earlier myths before we get into the creation of Adam and Eve?
Again, the sort of temporal cause is laying out what creation was like. Like these are things that maintain no consistency there in Genesis 2. Instead of having the primordial waters, you have dry land that has been, nothing's really been done with it. And this is again another type of picture that is can be generated in ancient Near Eastern cosmogonic texts, where you have this land that nothing's been done to it yet, and then the gods bring forth vegetation or animals or whatever.
In this case, God's speaking and it's coming forth.
Well, and here the J version, or the non-P version here in Genesis 2-3 is you have a much more anthropomorphic God,
right?
And he's making, he's doing, he's walking, and so this is far different, it seems, from the more transcendent deity that you see in priestly account in Genesis 1.
Right. So Genesis 2-3, we have this garden scene, creation of man. Then from the woman we have, which is from his rib, we have woman. Which, is there a myth that has anything to do with ribs that we should be possibly looking at that are found in the earlier stories? Isn't there some mention or play on a pun on the term rib or side or something? Or maybe while you think about that, like for the audience, at the beginning of chapter 2, it talks about these are the generations of Ernos and Gaia, if you're reading the Greek. the heavens and the earth. And some have actually noted what's odd about that is in the Greek cosmogony with the gods, Uranus and Gaia are like the first two gods, and they have all these children and stuff, and these are their generations, the generations of the descendants of these gods, which is an interesting thing to see in the Greek there.
Yeah.
But I don't know how that plays out in the Hebrew. Anyway,
I do think that there's something to say about the word to build. So, Eve is built, or, Yahweh Elohim builds Eve from this rib of the man. And that is noteworthy, the use of that verb to build. But it's something, because usually you have sort of like make or fashion or form or whatever. But so the Hebrew word is bana. In Akkadian, the cognate is banum. And that's a term that shows up in ancient Near Eastern and in Akkadian texts that are dealing with the formation of humanity, creation of humanity. So, and again, I lay out the examples of this in the chapter, but like that, there's certainly, this is the thing about the Garden of Eden narrative, and there's still work obviously being done on this. We were just talking about a volume, a 2014 volume, by Johannes de Moore.
yeah,
And,
Adam, Eve, and the devil, or something. Yeah.
and I hadn't read this one.
Yeah.
But, Bruce Wells is working on a volume, a monograph on this topic. Of course, Eckhart Fromm is writing on the Garden of Eden story now. And, even I'm looking into some aspects of the story that I don't think have been touched on, at least in the detail, that the way that I want to touch on them. But one of the things that seems to come up is this difficulty, as you pointed out in your documentary on the Adam and Eve story, is that scholars have a difficult time making a connection to a fully forged mythological narrative, like in the ancient world, that seems to run in parallel, or have broad similarities with,
like it's like almost like a antecedent text that is the text, or because like we can go to Gilgamesh, we see the serpent still the plant, or we can go to Adapa,
right?
And we can go, okay, hold on, food of immortality and food of death, and like life and death, and weird stuff there with a trickster god, which you do think there's something to this.
Yeah.
But like, it's almost like you have this buffet.
That's right. You have, in the same way that I think many artists, musical artists, will not pull wholesale from a song, but instead will pull bits and pieces from, a genre and bring them into their work to create something new in a song. I think the same thing is probably going on here, at least as far as we can tell. So, Bruce Wells makes the argument that the Adam and Eve figures are akin to these orchard servants, the tenders of the orchards there in the garden, and
Of Babylon.
Yeah, that's right. And so, making connections there as to how they were allowed to partake of food from the orchard in order to sustain themselves. And so, but again, that's not necessarily like a fully fledged narrative. It's just an aspect. But you hit on it, right? In Adapa in the South Wind, or in Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, you have here two stories that involve this missed opportunity at eternal life. And of course, scholars have talked about this for, years and years and years now. But there are aspects that I think they're pulling from ancient Near Eastern themes,
Right.
but no coherent narrative that we know of to this point.
Yeah, and that's why the book, Adam, Eve, and the Devil, I did a documentary, and just like me and my buddy Paul Davidson, who's very smart, dug into this, and he helped me craft the script and edited the video and everything. And in that myth, you have this snake who poisons the garden, like he causes an issue with the divine God's gardens. This is an Ugaritic text. It's KTU 100 and KTU 1, I can't remember the other one. very difficult to decipher and interpret, and scholars scratch their heads. Is this just a magical kind of text about how to deal with a snake bite? Or is this actually a text of a myth where the snake bites and causes mortality for humanity in a garden, and the gods make a pact with the underworld deity Haranu and end up having him get rid of the snake, but he has to marry one of the goddesses on the mountain of the gods. So there's a pact between heaven and the underworld. Like it's just fun. It's wow. We don't know. So we're out of the garden. We know these are obviously myths, and we have plenty of other examples we can draw from, but which is it? Or are they being creative and elusive in that sense? Or are we missing something that might have been an in-between state of some myth that we just don't have? We're leaving the Garden of Eden, and we're getting to the historical Cain and Abel, where that happened.
Yes.
Where he is marked out, and he's afraid of all the people. And people always point this out, but they're not there. What the hell's going on, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's a much ink has been spilled on the Cain and Abel story. And while there's, I don't know that we have any sort of definitive answers. Ronald Hendel has a great commentary that he's just come out with on Genesis 1 through 11 in the Yale Anchor Bible Commentary series. We'll recommend people take a look at that. But yeah, I mean, there's always discussion about Cain and Abel and, pastoralists versus, agriculturalists, and which one is the one that is, favored by God. And
Of course.
so, yeah, there's a lot, again, that's going on there. These are, sort of broad things I think that you see throughout the ancient years, because again, these are forms, this is the way of life, right? And you had this tension.
Were there any older brother killing of the other brother myths, like Romulus and Remus, where they're like twins, or it seems like they're really close brothers, and then one has to kill the other one, and he ends up getting like authority or gaining the upper hand? I don't know. I just was thinking maybe because it seems like a common myth where two brothers kill each other, and one ends up, getting power or continuing.
Trying to think of one. Nothing's coming to mind.
It could be. There's so many myths out there. So I just figured I'd ask you if you knew. And a lot of people try to tie in Cain as a representation of the nation of not the Canaanites. The Canaanites. Sorry. Yeah. So they're like etiological myths for these tribes of people. That's another fun part. So we're moving out of Cain and Abel. He kills his brother. He is marked and has to escape. And now we're kind of getting into the first genealogy.
Right.
And the first genealogy, and then you bump into this next genealogy. So between the first genealogy and the second, these divine ones come down and end up with these women. Any indications in the earlier myths that you know of where divine ones are mating with mortal women? I find it all over the Greek world. That's why I ask. I know Gilgamesh was like 2/3 divine.
Sure.
Flying something there maybe, but
Yeah, and I mean, certainly in the Gilgamesh epic, you have, Ishtar, who's, and even in Anala's descent, like Tammuz a king. So, I mean, you do have these types of interactions, but I mean, something more precise, like what you see in Genesis 6:1-4. I can't think of anything that is more precise like that.
yeah. Yeah, and you know what I'm asking for. Like you could give generalities again, but the point is that there's order that's supposed to be kept from, of course, the narrative, and they broke that order. The divine's not supposed to be with the human. That's why the Pishtim's out here.
That's right.
They're out here.
And this is why it's one of the, I think, important aspects that runs really throughout the primeval history is keeping the separation between heaven and earth. And I mean, of course, if you read through the priestly account in Genesis 1, it's all about separation. He's separated light from darkness. He's separated, the waters below and the waters above. He's keeping heaven and earth separated. Like this, it's all about separation, a demarcation of things into their distinct places and roles and time and so on. And so when we think about this separation between the divine realm and the human realm, you see it attempting to be crossed in the garden, which is why the Yahweh Elohim has to say, shit, they've they've eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and so they as the serpent said, they become like gods. They have this divine knowledge now, lest they reach out their hand and take from the tree of life also, and become immortal. We gotta get them out of here. So again, it's this crossing, this attempt to cross boundaries. You see it, of course, then in Genesis 6:1-4, with these sons of God coming into the daughters of men. Again, this, of course, gets developed quite extensively in the Book of Enoch.
Yeah.
Assuming this, Genesis priority, which, I'm not a specialist in that, so I could talk to Nicholsburg about this, but and then, of course, in the Tower of Babel, or the city and Tower of Babel story, here we have humanity coming together. They've been given the command now twice to go and to spread out and to take dominion over the land, and yet instead they're coming together in the city of Babylon, which, surprise, surprise, not a surprise to anyone, they're coming together in Babylon.
And that's in Genesis that they're coming together in Babylon.
That's right. That's what Babel is.
Right. So Babel is Babylon, which is a ziggurat. And
Yeah.
we're kind of jumping ahead, but this is important because we're wanting to wrap this thing. That is Babylon, ziggurat, Noah, this flood. This is clearly building off of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, the flood narrative, correct?
Yeah, and probably even more broad, certainly the flood tradition is, right? The flood stories. But I think more broadly, in Genesis 1-11, it's utilizing specific aspects of ancient Near Eastern mythology, ancient Mesopotamian mythology, particularly those in Akkadian, and building this broader polemic. And I know we've talked about this before, but so that it's in the context here, there is movement in Mesopotamia, as we talked about Gilgamesh. The positive movement, the best place to be in Mesopotamia is in the city. So, if you read through Sumerian texts or Akkadian texts that talk about, like the marriage of Martu is one that always comes to mind for me. But there are so many others that talk about the people that live in the mountains or the people that live away from the cities. These are the backwoods. They're unsophisticated, uncultured. They eat meat like animals. They don't know how to say correct prayers. They're the backwoodsy people that don't get it. And so when we think about the relationship between, in Mesopotamian thought, between those that are outside of the cities, living, even outside of the countryside, out there, away from civilization, and those that are living in the city, obviously, what you want is to be in the city. And this is why in the early part of, and really throughout the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have Enkidu, who's this wild man who's out living in the steppe, rhyme of the animals, right? Adam. And, you'll note that his companions, those that he's running with, are the animals. You notice that in Genesis 3 or in Genesis 2, all the animals are brought before Adam to see if there's an Ezer, right? This, I don't even know what a good word for that. We always say helper, but that makes it sound like a subordinate. But nonetheless, none are suitable to him. None are his counterpart.
Right.
And so in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the pinnacle of movement for Enkidu is getting him away from this state of innocence, out in the steppe, running with the animals, to life in the city with, particularly in Uruk, with Gilgamesh. So making him change more human, having him drink beer and eat bread, put on clothing, like these are all really good things. This this is the way movement should be toward the city. And of course, in the Hebrew Bible, in Genesis 1 through 11, you have that same movement. You have Adam and Eve, and they're originally in the garden, and their animal like isn't quite what I would say, but they're not clothed. You know, but they're unashamed. They have the state of innocence. They don't have any of this real knowledge that you would get in civilization, and that's good. That's where God wants them to be and wants them to stay. As far as the internal framework of the narrative, that's where they're supposed to be.
Right.
And through sin, through doing the wrong thing, they move out of that state of innocence. So it's the same direction of movement, but it's bad. And of course, this all coalesces. It comes to a head in the city and Tower of Babel story, Genesis 11. So again, the movement is still toward Babylon. It's still toward this major Mesopotamian city, but all of that is bad. It's not the movement that you're supposed to have. And so then in Genesis, end of chapter 11, the beginning of 12, you have Abraham called out of Ur of the Chaldeans, out of Mesopotamia, out of southern Mesopotamia, to wander. He's away from the cities to wander in the
wilderness or until he gets shown a land and all that. And then this is where I see a lot of overlap with Argonauts, the Jason Argonautic myth, where there's a promised land, and it's foreshadowing like you're going to get this land for my people are going to have a land, and they have the genealogies and all of that. But so recapping, just again, keep in mind, there's no specific for the viewer. There's no not in every case do you need an antecedent text, an exact antecedent text, but imagine a buffet of Mesopotamian, ancient Near Eastern mythologies that they are obviously able to pull from and craft a interesting narratives that get spliced together. We have creation myth like Enuma Elish, the way it starts, to home, likely having common ground with Tiamat, splitting of waters and dry land appearing, a version of creation of man, but it's like a general 7-day theme, boom, and it's all good. Then you get this hands dirty God who's willing in a particular land. He's of a particular area. He only reigns that area of Eden, whatever this place is, wherever this place is, but it's clearly away from wherever humanity dwells, because he kicks them out and they have to dwell out here. Wherever they're dwelling, they have to work extra hard to try and find food, meaning it might be hinting at that nomadic kind of implication, kind of a anachronism in the narrative or something, or a foretelling of the narrative, so to speak. Adam only knows animals, doesn't have a real equal mate or partner, and just like Enkidu had animals, so there's hints there. He gets I almost want to say tamed like Shamhat, you know what I mean, in a way, by the woman. And then they are kicked out. Mortality's brought in. There's a snake that shows up in the story. And clearly Gilgamesh has that, and the other myths in Utgarit, and then flipping past that to this brothers kill each other. Interesting brotherly type myth that we find in other places like Romulus and Remus. Then you go past that to genealogies, which seem to hint at some kind of inspiration from the Sumerian kings list. And we know as late as Berosus, they're playing with the kings list. So we can't pretend it's not relevant even in the Hellenistic period. You get outside of that, you get this flood, you get God sleeping with mortal women, flood stuff that we see in Gilgamesh Epic Tablet 11 and others. Atrahasis, you have flood stuff. Then you get outside of the flood and he sacrifices and the God's like, I'm sorry, man, I should have never done that. Thank you for making my dinner. Then they move into another genealogy and it's heading into Babylon and it's getting away from all that. There's so much here. Yeah. Anyone is honest in looking at this and knows the other stories would not try to just go, oh, these are just generalities.
Yeah, I mean, everybody, it's like, you're in a studio and I'm in a studio,
It's clear. It's inspired by these stories, but it's also doing its own thing.
Yeah. I mean, dependence on the earlier mythological texts is I think, very clear.
And I want to reverse the final question. We don't like the whole historical, I'll say BS. You're trying to bring history into this. But if you were to, would you say be more consistent to try and make a historical case on the earlier materials that you're riffing from? So suppose someone wanted to make a historical case. wouldn't you think being more consistent, and it is hypothetical, but would be like, all right, I need to go back to Gilgamesh. I need to go back to Sumerian and say, these happened. This is history. And that way I could anchor my Genesis myth in history, not pretend like mine happened. These are myth and didn't happen or something. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as you said, like the idea of trying to do that is, and to be fair, the idea of seeing mythological texts as allegory is not something that hasn't been looked at before. So, we've had Assyriologists that have tried to do this with, stories about Inanna.
Right.
And, is that possible? Sure, that's possible. And there are certainly cases in like certain city limits, Sumerian city limits, that references being made to like the king Dagon. And so you can see that there are times when there is something historical standing behind the narrative. That being said, I think that looking for something in the Hebrew Bible that that we could get at would be, I don't know, a fool's errand, given that they're, as you say, they're pulling from an earlier mythological tradition that comes from a different region. And in so doing, like, what you'd have to do is establish where did this blood tradition begin, which I think we've been able to do pretty reasonably. Early second millennium, this starts to enter into the corpus. And why? Like, why would it start to come in then? Those are all good questions. Some people have written on it. I think it's going to be difficult to ascertain if there is some sort of like event course that stand behind it.
I appreciate you, Dr. Josh. Ladies and gentlemen, go take the Sumerian course that he has. Go take the Hebrew Bible course. He's teaching languages, teaching you how to read and write in these languages. Go take the class and learn. Links are in the description. You can also take his Myths Borrowed by the Bible course, and we have his other course, Slavery in the Bible, as well. I really appreciate you.
Thank you.